November 3, 1946 to 15 in the afternoon, at an old Air Force base in Bedfordshire, England, Margaret Whitmore stood in the doorway of the building that was Calit 7, Section B, and tried hard not to cry behind her. A big truck was waiting with a few things she and her husband had saved from their house in Portsmouth after it was bombed, a set of cups and plates that had belonged to her grandmother, some clothes, a few pictures, and William's new suit for leaving the army. Still wrapped up. Inside the hut, the plain, wavy metal roof curved over their heads like a half-pipe, which made it look more like a storage shed than a place to live. The floor was made of hard cement. A single small heater sat in the middle, and its smoke pipe went up through a hole cut in the metal roof. Two thin windows let in the gray, cold November light, which did nothing to make the room warmer. This was it. This was where they would live, where they would try to start a new life after 6 years of war. It had killed Margaret's brother, hurt her husband, and destroyed the house they had bought 3 years after they got married. A curved metal tube, 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, was split by thin wood walls into 3 small apartments that all shared the same cold air and one coal heater. There was no running water inside. That water came from a pump outside that served all the huts in the row. The bathroom was in a separate building 50 steps away. William walked up behind her, walking with a slight limp from the injury that had sent him home from Italy in 1944. He looked at the hut, then at his wife's face, and tried to think of something nice to say. Well, he finally managed, "At least it's not raining inside." Margaret laughed, a sound that was a mix of funny and sad. "No," she agreed, "at least we have that." They unloaded their truck and started the job off, turning a military building into something that felt like a home, because that was what people had to do. Britain had won the war. Now it had to get through the time of peace. And if that meant living in old army huts, then that's what British families would do. They would manage. They would keep going. They would find ways to make cold metal into warm homes. Because the other choice was too awful to think about. The math of destruction. Britain came out of World War II as the winner in the fighting. But its home country was ruined in ways that numbers couldn't fully show. The bombing attacks that Germany had launched against British cities from 1940 to 1945 had ruined or badly hurt about 4 million homes. London alone had lost about 1/3 of its houses to bombs and fires. The center of Coventry City was completely wiped out in November 1940. Hull, Plymouth, Bristol, Southampton, Birmingham, every big city and many smaller ones had scars from the bombing that had killed 60,000 British people and left hundreds of thousands without a home. The damage was not just physical. Britain's money was all gone. Its supplies used up by 6 years of total war. The country had spent everything it had to stay alive and win, leaving almost nothing left to rebuild. Building materials were hard to find. Wood was needed for the supports in coal mines. Steel was needed to rebuild factories. Cement was limited for important building projects. Skilled construction workers were still being released from the military and slowly returning to regular jobs. The lack of housing was not just a problem of damaged buildings, but a basic inability to rebuild fast and auto meet the need. The numbers were harsh. Britain needed millions of new homes, but could only build maybe 100,000 each year using the old ways of building with the materials they had. At that speed, the housing problem would last for many years, leaving families in temporary places, or worse, through their children's whole childhoods. The problem needed quick fixes, even if they were not perfect. That could be done fast with the materials they had. That would give people shelter now instead of perfect houses later. The government's answer was based on what they learned during the war about building quickly and using temporary buildings. During the war, Britain had built thousands of buildings using parts made ahead of time, putting up camps and facilities in weeks instead of months. Those same methods used for regular houses might solve the immediate problem while the normal rebuilding went on at the same time. The solution would not be beautiful or last forever, but it would be fast and useful, which was exactly what the situation needed. The practical mind of the inventor, the Nissen hut, named after its designer, Major Peter Norman Nissen of the Royal Engineers, showed how military engineers solved problems, find the smallest needs, design the simplest possible answer, and make it easy to build and move. Nissen had created the design in 1916 during World War I. When British soldiers in France needed a place to stay that could be put up quickly, bend the battle lines, moved easily, and built by soldiers with very little training or tools. His answer was simply smart. A half-round building made of wavy iron sheets bolted to a steel frame, with wooden walls at the ends that had doors and windows. The curved shape made it strong, like an arch, spreading the weight well, while the wavy iron was easy to get, lightweight, and kept out the weather. A team of 6 men could put up a regular hut in 4 hours, using only wrenches and simple hand tools. The design worked so well that it stayed mostly the same through World War II. The British military made Nissen huts by the thousands, sending them all over the world to every place where British forces fought. In North Africa, they survived the desert heat and sandstorms. In the Arctic, they gave shelter against the terrible cold. In the Pacific, they held up against the tropical wetness and heavy rains. They were used as sleeping quarters, hospitals, dining halls, command centers, storage rooms, workshops, churches, and movie theaters. Any job that needed a roof could be done by setting up and fitting out a basic building in the right way. The hut's time in the military showed both its good points and bad points, which would matter later for regular people. They were indeed fast to put up and did not need special building skills. They were strong. If put together right and taken care of, they lasted 4 years, even though they were meant to be temporary buildings. They could be changed. The inside layout could be easily changed to fit different needs, but they were also uncomfortable. The metal structure let heat pass through easily, making them like ovens in summer and freezers in winter. Unless they were covered and heated. Water drops formed on the inside walls when it was humid. The curved walls made it hard to arrange furniture and reduced the floor space that could be used. They were loud in the rain or wind, with the metal banging and shaking in a way that made sleeping hard for military use. These bad points were okay. Soldiers could be told to live in uncomfortable places, and military bases had shared service. It made up for the problems of the individual huts. But changing these buildings into family homes would mean fixing their worst problems while accepting that a perfect home was not possible because of the lack of supplies and the urgent need from camps to communities. The change from military to regular use started with the buildings that were already standing across Britain, especially many camps that had held soldiers, prisoners of war, and other wartime groups. By 1945, Britain had about 400,000 German and Italian prisoners of war in camps spread across the country, most of which were Nissen huts set up in nitros with shared facilities. As these prisoners were slowly sent back home through 1946 and 1947, their camps became free for other uses. At the same time, military bases were closing as soldiers left the army, freeing up thousands more Nissen huts that had housed British service members. The government's Emergency Housing Plan, announced in 1944 and made bigger after the war ended, chose many of these places to be changed into temporary homes for regular people. The camps already had roads, water pipes, sewer systems, and electricity where they had it, which made them smart choices. Even though they were often far away, changing them only needed a small amount of money, putting up walls to split the huts into family units, putting in places to cook, giving them furniture and basic things, and making the insulation and heating better where they could. The quality was very different from place to place. Some changes were well thought out and fairly comfortable. Huts properly covered, given good heaters, and provided with enough furniture and facilities. Others were barely changed from the military design, with families expected to manage with very little heat, shared facilities, and homemade ways of living. The differences showed the lack of supplies, how good the local government was, and simple luck about which camp one was sent to. Margaret and William Whitmore's hut in Bedfordshire is somewhere in the middle in terms of quality. The Air Force Base had been a large place during the war with good basic services. Their part of Hut 7 was about 16 feet by 12 feet, small, but not impossible for a couple without children. The hut had been slightly covered with pressed wood on the inside walls. Giving some protection from the cold, the small heater could keep the space a little warm if it was fed coal all the time. They shared the water pump and toilets with 3 other families in the huts next door. An arrangement that needed everyone to work together, but it was possible. Their neighbors in the other parts of Hut 7 quickly became important for survival and staying sane. The Johnsons had 2 small children, and so they had first access to the water pump for washing. The Patel family, who had recently arrived from India where Mr. Patel had served in the Indian Army, handled the British winter with a good attitude, and shared ways to stay warm that they had learned in mountain stations in the Himalayas. Everyone helped everyone else, because no family could manage alone, watching children while mothers waited in line for food rations, sharing fuel when someone ran out before the next delivery, lending tools and knowledge for the endless small repairs that living together required. Making do. The process of turning military buildings into homes needed new ideas, strong will, and accepting that comfort would be just okay, not great. Margaret attacked their space with energy that came from being happy to have any home at all. The cement floor was cold and hard, so she and William found linoleum from a junkyard in the nearby town, piecing together enough to cover most of the floor. The wavy metal walls were sad, bare metal. So Margaret made curtains from parachute silk that William had gotten through secret military extra supplies. She hung them up to make the space softer and to help block some noise. They built simple furniture from wood they found, shelves for their few things, a table and chairs made from old ammo boxes and rough wood, a screen to separate the sleeping area from the living space. The coal heater became the most important thing in their home life and a constant worrying. It needed to be fed every few hours to keep a little warmth, using up coal given through a rationing system that never seemed to be enough. On the coldest winter nights, ice formed on the inside walls even with the heater working hard, and families woke up to frozen water in their wash basins. Margaret learned to cover the fire carefully at night, making a slow burn that lasted until morning instead of a hot fire that used up the coal but left them cold by dawn. She learned which spots near the heater were warmest, moving their small amount of furniture to get the most benefit from its heat. Managing water needed careful planning. The pump outside served many families and froze often in winter, requiring someone to melt the ice each morning by wrapping it in rags soaked with hot water carried from someone's heater. Margaret set up a routine, fill the kettle and pots each morning for the day's cooking and washing, to keep trips outside in bad weather to a minimum. Laundry was a special challenge. Washing clothes meant heating a lot of water, doing the wash, and then drying the clothes in a space that was already too small. She learned to do laundry in days when the weather was good enough to hang clothes outside, and to set up drying racks near the heater on wet days. Even though this made the space almost impossible to bear with the wet air, cooking on the coal heater meant learning old ways Margaret had used as a child before her family had a proper stove. The top of the heater was the cooking area, with the heat controlled by changing how much coal was added and moving pots closer or farther from the hottest spots. She couldn't bake because there was no oven, so she learned to steam puddings and make stovetop meals that stretched their small amount of food. Neighbors shared recipes and methods. A group lesson in being poor, cooking that many had last done during the hard times years before the war. But slowly, through months of hard work and getting used to it, Hut 7, Section B, started to look like a home. Margaret's curtains softened the metal walls. Pictures of family and William's Army group in italic created places to remember and feel like themselves. The tea set that had belonged to Margaret's grandmother sat on their homemade shelf, connecting them to the destroyed house and to the normal life they were trying to rebuild. Small touches, a rug near the door, plants, and metal cans on the windowsill. William's neat writing on a wooden sign that read "The Whitmores" changed Thepplin Military Building into a space that was theirs. Even if it wasn't perfect, across Britain, similar changes were happening in thousands of huts as families got used to a situation that was both impossible and unavoidable. The groups of people that formed in these temporary housing areas created their own ways of life and social rules. Residents started groups to manage shared facilities and talk to the government for improvements. They made rules for keeping the shared areas clean and orderly. They created social events, community meetings, activities for children, and celebrations of holidays and important moments that helped turn collections of huts into real communities. Children got used to it the fastest, finding good things adults couldn't see. The open spaces between the huts became playgrounds where many children could play together. Watched easily by mothers whose huts all faced the common area, the strange buildings became the setting for big games. The huts turned into spaceships or submarines or castles, depending on what the children imagined. Kids who might have grown up in separate houses instead formed close groups, bonded by the shared experience of growing up in Tin Town. Adults found it harder to adjust, but they managed because they had to. Men coming back from the military had experience with rough living and shared arrangements that helped them adjust. Women, who had the main job of taking care of the house in these hard conditions, gained skills and strength that their lives before the war might not have needed. Older people struggled the most. The cold was harder on older bodies, the physical work of carrying water and fuel was more difficult, and the lack of privacy was more tiring. Communities usually came together to help their oldest residents, but the conditions were clearly hard on those least able to handle them. The settlements also showed differences between social classes that British society usually ignored. Families with professional jobs and working-class families found themselves as neighbors in huts that looked the same from the outside, creating a closeness that normal housing patterns usually stopped. Some adjusted well, finding common ground in the shared difficulty. Others kept a careful distance, showing class differences through small signs in how they spoke, who they spent time with, and their attitudes. Even though they lived in the same conditions, the local town's relationships with the hut settlements were different, from accepting to unfriendly. Some towns welcomed the extra people and their buying power, bringing the settlements into the town's life. Others disliked the newcomers, seeing them as temporary residents who did not truly belong, whose children crowded schools, whose presence reminded everyone of the war's problems. The settlements themselves often made this separation stronger, being physically far from the town centers, creating communities that were both a part of the local area and separate from it. The temporary that lasted, the huts had been called emergency housing, expected to be used for 5 years at most while proper houses were built. The truth was different. Britain's recovery after the war was slower than hopeful people had thought. Money problems sconted through the late 1940s. Building materials were still hard to find. Normal house building continued but could not keep up with the need from a growing population. New families starting, and the ongoing repair of war damage. The temporary huts that were supposed to last until 1950 were still housing families in 1955, and some were still used into the 1960s. The Whitmores lived in Hut 7, Section B, for 9 years. Their first child was born in 1948. Delivered in the local hospital but brought home to the hut that Margaret had somehow made welcoming despite its problems. The baby's arrival made the space incredibly small. Where do you put a baby bed, change diapers, or store baby clothes in a 16 by 12-foot space already full of adult life? Margaret made it work through organizing everything very carefully, by accepting that nothing could be left out randomly, by learning to live in a space that had no room for mess. William found a job at a local factory, walking 3 miles each way because they could not afford a bicycle. His pay was small but steady. Letting them save a little money for a real house later, they applied many times for a house from the local council. Their names on waiting lists that seemed never to move forward. Meanwhile, they made their hut better little by little. Better insulation bought and put in over several months. A small oil heater for very cold nights, the linoleum replaced when the first one wore out. Curtains changed from parachute silk to real fabric bought at a high cost. The hut handled Britain's weather with different levels of success. Summer heat was okay. They could open the windows and door for air and spend time outside where the grass and flowers they had planted created a small garden. Winter was harder. Each year the cold seemed to bite deeper, the effort of staying warm more tiring. The roof leaked sometimes, even with William's repairs, needing pots to catch the drips until he could fix the problem. Wine shook the building, making sleep hard during storms. But it still kept the weather out well enough, kept them dry and a little warm, and provided a roof that did not fall down or walls that did not break, the final change. When the Whitmores finally got the keys to a council house in 1955, Margaret's feeling was complicated, not just simple happiness. The new house was everything the hut was not: proper brick walls, separate bedrooms, indoor toilet and sink, central heating, a yard with a fence around it. It meant a normal life, the life they had expected to live before the war messed everything up, the home their child deserved. But leaving the hut meant leaving the community they had built over 9 years. Neighbors who had become friends through shared difficulty. The place where their son had taken his first steps and said his first words. The day they moved, neighbors gathered to help load their things and say goodbye. Mrs. Johnson cried, though she said it was just dust in her eyes. Mr. Patel shook William's hand and simply said, "You were good neighbors." The hut stood empty after they left, waiting for the next people to live there, or maybe to be torn down. Margaret did not know and could not quite bring herself to ask. Across Britain, this scene happened thousands of times through the 1950s and early 1960s. As families moved up from temporary huts to permanent houses, some settlements were completely torn down. The huts taken apart or used for other things, others stayed, partly used. Slowly falling apart, a few huts were bought by the people living in them and changed a lot to become acceptable homes, properly covered, connected to utilities, made comfortable through money spent that the government had never allowed but could not stop. The huts themselves turned out to be very strong. Buildings designed to last 5 years often stood for decades. Some were changed for farm use, storage sheds, animal shelters, workshops. Others became garden sheds, garages, or storage for businesses. The basic design was good enough that proper care could make them last almost forever, though few buildings were cared for that well after people stopped living in them. By the 1970s, most huts were gone, removed because they looked bad or were unsafe, replaced by proper house or turned back into farmland. But a few examples remained, some still lived in by old people who had been there for decades and refused to leave. Others were saved by accident through neglect or on purpose as interesting old things, the plain truth. The Nissen huts were not a great success of British cleverness or a sign of a strong spirit, though they showed both. They were a practical answer to a terrible situation. Temporary steps that became semi-permanent because rebuilding a country was harder and slower than anyone had hoped. The families who lived in them did so because they had no other choice, doing the best they could in situations that were truly hard while waiting for better options that came slowly or sometimes not at all. What was left after the huts were gone was the memory of a time when British families had survived in wavy metal tubes, had made homes from military buildings, had raised children and built lives in spaces that should have been temporary. Became the most important experiences. Not glory, but lasting. Not heroism, but strong will. Not a grand story, but the simple truth of people doing what they had to do because the other choice was too awful to think about. The ugly huts that nobody wanted became homes because homes are what people make them through hard work and love and refusing to give up, even when things seemed impossible. That was Britain after the war, not beautiful. Not comfortable, just steady, keeping on through hardship until something better could happen, the Nissen huts. Ugly and not good enough, but somehow just enough. Stood as monuments to that steady will until they were finally, thankfully, replaced by the proper houses that should have been built years earlier but somehow never were until much too late for those who needed them most.